Boaz and Ruth had a very unusual courtship, and we can read through. Not your usual boy meets girl, girl meets boy, fall in love and get married. It was an unusual courtship. There's a whole book in the Bible devoted to it. But one thing is significant, they both had very positive reputations. I'm not going to talk about any of those people today because there's another couple that fit together with the pattern of dancing in the rain. And that particular couple is Priscilla and Aquila. So really that's the subject today, is Priscilla and Aquila. And this is a couple in the New Testament. But the story doesn't really start with Priscilla and Aquila. The story starts with the Apostle Paul in Athens, Greece, on Mars Hill, what they call the Areopagus, a tall outcropping of rock. And they had, where they were worshiping many gods. And in the Roman Empire, you would have maybe 1,000 different gods. And he said, you ought to worship the unknown God that you have this particular edifice for. And he had a mixed response. Some people liked it. He got cheers and he got jeers. Well, the bottom line was he left Athens, and he went from Athens in Greece to Corinth. And so that's when we say, that's the background. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. Now, this is all during Paul's second missionary journey. And so he had reason to go to Corinth because it was a mixed bag back in Athens. Now, it was 52 miles. I went on to Google Maps, and I said, well, how far is it from Athens to Corinth? And I went, well, he walked 52 miles. So if you take 2 miles an hour and you walk 8 miles a day, let's see, that'd be 8 hours a day, that's 16 miles. He had to take whatever he had with him, pack on him. So it'd take about 3.5 days. He'd have to stop, pitch his tent or whatever he was. There weren't a lot of motels, folks, or restaurants along the way. So you got to figure things out as he goes. So he made it his 52 miles over to Corinth. And when he went to Corinth, he met Priscilla and Aquila. Now, he may have known them earlier. We don't know. Or at least I don't know. Somebody may know. This couple, Priscilla and Aquila, and it gives us a little description. We're going to go through Acts 18, so if you want to keep your bookmark there, that's pretty much where we're going to be most of this time. We're following the events through. And he came across a certain Jew named Aquila, who was born in Pontus. Well, I kind of wondered, where in the world is Pontus? And his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, who was the emperor, Roman emperor, told him they had Jews, and that included Christians, had to get out of Rome. So, first of all, Aquila and presumably Priscilla came from Pontus. So where in the world is Pontus? Well, if we take a look at, it's in Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. And that, if you take a look at it, that's a long ways away. That would be maybe 500 miles from Pontus over to Corinth. But remember, they had just come 750 miles from Rome to get to Corinth. They were kicked out of Rome, so Aquila and Priscilla were kicked out. The emperor said, everybody's got to go if you're a Jew, and that included Christians because they were indistinguishable to them. They all met on the Sabbath. So they were evicted in AD 45, traveled to Corinth. Now, 750 miles, now the sum of it's over water, so they spent some time traveling. I don't know how long it takes you to travel 750 miles. That's halfway from here to San Diego. And again, there weren't a lot of motels and not a lot of come-and-go gas stations and so forth along the way. So, incidentally then, when Paul showed up in Corinth, he stayed with Priscilla and Aquila. Now you say, well, why? Well, how did he bump into them? Well, not only because of their beliefs as Christians, they were of the same trade. They were all tent makers. Now, and if you know, as tent makers, they were all working together on projects here. And, and of course, that was the day job, being a tent maker. And so every weekend, every Sabbath, Paul, boy, it's a cough today. Paul was, of course, preaching on the Sabbath and then working as a tent maker during the week. Now, tent makers, we often think of tents like we do today, where they're made of cloth or canvas and so forth. Well, not so much. In that day and age, they had their tools of the trade that they took with them. So they would, when they moved or when they went someplace, this was packed, not only their personal possessions, but they had the tools of the trade. Thank you. And many of the tents were made from leather. Now, it doesn't tell us how they got the leather, but I've read on some commentaries it said they had to slaughter the animals to get the leather, or other case. So it wasn't always a neat and clean embroidery type tent making. So Paul lived with Priscilla and Aquila for 18 months. Now, whenever you live in somebody else's house, it changes the dynamic in that house. Oh, I see some of you may have known that. Now, I was a high school teacher, my wife and I, for many years. And when a new student comes into the room, it changes the dynamic in the classroom. And then when a student leaves the room, it can change the dynamic. Same thing happens in families, same thing happens with people. It doesn't matter if they're friends or strangers. It changes how you react to each other. So imagine a guest living in your house for a year and a half. But you'll notice it says teaching the word of God among them. Now, can you imagine the Apostle Paul living in our house for a year and a half? Which means I presume we'd all have to make special note to be nicer to each other, right? I mean, Apostle Paul is there. And of course, he's explaining what to and how to for that period of time. So, and they had to have been able to get along. They didn't cast each other out. So in Acts, we continue on in Acts 18, and verses 18 and 19. So Paul remained there for a good while. But he was determined to go to Jerusalem. And of course, the nearest seaport was Caesarea on the Mediterranean. But he was also, so he took off. On the way, though, he sailed across the Aegean. He took Priscilla and Aquila with him. Why would he do that? Well, they've just had a year and a half of training. How long is ABC? It's one school year. So if you're living and working with somebody, there's a lot of education that's happening there. And Paul came to Ephesus. And of course, they took their tools of the trade with them. And I went to Google Maps again, and I said, well, if I'm going to go from Corinth to Ephesus, 318 miles is what it says. Well, some of that's over water, which would be a lot quicker, as long as you don't get blown off course. So Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey, is really about 1,000 miles from Rome. So now Priscilla and Aquila have come 750 plus miles, and then another 300 plus miles. So they're roughly 1,000 miles from Rome, which is where they were at the beginning of chapter 18. And it says Paul took them with him. So they had to have value. Valuable Paul or Priscilla and Aquila had to have value for Paul. And then when he was ready to leave Ephesus, the people there said, "Want you to stay longer. Isn't that what you'd want too? Hey, why don't you stay longer? We're not done." But Paul said, "I have to go keep the feast." He's talking about spring feast in Jerusalem. But I'll return again. Now, this is his second missionary journey, and he sailed from Ephesus. Now, I couldn't, on Google Maps, it doesn't show the sailing route, but if he were to travel overland, it'd be over 680 miles, and he's walked it the first time around, but now he knows better, and he's going to sail on the way back, and he does, and sails on the way. So I presume it's about the same distance, but a lot quicker to sail. And I showed this to Antioch because that's where Paul started from, was in Antioch, which is in modern-day Syria. And people say, well, why was the church so big in Antioch? Because we read a little bit about that. But bear in mind, Paul left Priscilla and Aquila behind. And he went to actually sail to Caesarea and then walked to both Jerusalem and to Antioch. Now, Antioch was an important location commercially because it was on the end of the Silk Road from China. Now, if you take a look at this time, there was a lot of commerce. Camels in particularly crossed the deserts, but it was the commerce, and that was the jumping off point for Europe, for a lot of goods to be traded back and forth. You've heard of the term fine China? That's where it came from. And many of those products were there. And it was a strong Christian congregation. We go back to Acts 11. We can read that that's where people first started being called Christians. So Paul wanted to get back. He wanted to go to Jerusalem, and he wanted to go to Antioch. So he left Priscilla and Aquila behind in Ephesus. They had been taught, they had been trained, they were working together. So if you take a look, it's roughly about 1,000 miles away from where he started out from to where he actually wound up later. Now, when he left Priscilla and Aquila behind, they had a responsibility to care for this local congregation, which incidentally met in their home. And we read in Acts 18 and verse 24 that there was a Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, which is in Egypt. And it says an eloquent man. Eloquent? He spoke well. He was captivating. He brought people to him. And Alexandria had a reputation for being a very educated place. And so verse 25, he had been instructed in the way of the Lord, being fervent in spirit, and he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, although he only knew the baptism of John. He did the best he could with what he had, and he was noted for that. But now we take a look that, and when he was speaking, it says he spoke boldly in the synagogue. And now here's the kicker. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Now the King James uses the term more perfectly. And you'll notice several things. One is he was invited to speak at the congregation in Ephesus. And they took him aside, meaning privately. They didn't say, oh, by the way, Apollos, you really messed up on that one. Point 2, 3, and 4 are kind of all wet, and let's go here. 1 and 5 are okay. No, they didn't do that. They said, let's do a better job here, because they had been taught by Paul, who had been taught by Christ. So they explained it. They worked together here to do that. You notice it doesn't say Aquila took them to the side or Priscilla did. They were, as it were, in a dance floor together to help Apollos. And what's interesting is it appears that Apollos was accepting of their understanding. And this acceptance was huge because Priscilla and Aquila were obviously working together. Later on, when Paul wrote back to the Corinthians, and he wrote in the first book of Corinthians, he writes, the churches of Asia greet you. Aquila and Priscilla greet you. Because they're going to remember Priscilla and Aquila. They all three used to be there in that Corinthian congregation. And who are the churches in Asia? Well, there's a number of them, but especially where Priscilla and Aquila were living, which was in Ephesus at the time. And it tells us that they were meeting in their house. I don't know how many of us have a church meeting in our house. I don't know the size of their house. I have been in a house. My son-in-law's parents had church in their house when we went there. Almost 25 years ago, and they had a great room in there, and the local congregation all met in this large room. And I'd not seen a house church before, but there was 3 dozen people meeting in their great living room. So I can imagine this. It's easy for me to imagine. So Paul mentions Aquila and Priscilla to the Corinthian congregation. In other words, kind of binding us, holding them together. Now, Paul wrote a second letter to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 6:14, and it says, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. What fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? But he knows, this had to have come about in part because Priscilla and Aquila were equally yoked. They were working together. One saw the other, and Paul could see how they were working together. And we know that you can't work together, except as in Amos 3:3, can two walk together unless they are agreed. So there had to be a unity or a bond for which Priscilla and Aquila had. Later, Paul wrote another letter and another mention of Priscilla and Aquila in 2 Timothy 4:19. Now, first of all, it says Prisca. I want to just know Prisca is actually the legal formal name, and Priscilla is the common nickname, as it were. So it's just like you would have Kathleen and Kathy, Deborah and Debbie, and so forth. So he's talking about the same people, and he's writing to them, and apparently they were still in Ephesus because he's telling Timothy to greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of, and hang on to the Greek names, folks, Onesiphorus. Anyway, apparently he had died, so that's why he's saying to the household. He's giving some morning greeting there. But clearly, Paul still has them on his mind. He's how far away? He's 1,000 miles away. He's writing to his helper Timothy, and he's writing to the Corinthian church, but who's foremost on his mind when he writes to these people are Priscilla and Aquila. And indeed, when Paul writes to the Romans in Romans 16:3, he says, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. Now, you say, wait a minute, how would the Romans know him? Well, either they were Christians before they left Rome, or they went back to Rome. Now, remember, it's a long ways from Ephesus, way back to Rome. But the Emperor Claudius kicked all Jews and Christians out of Rome in 45 AD. But Claudius died. And after he died, Jews and Christians then migrated back to Rome. So if you go back and take a look, and thank you to Google Maps, if they walked on land for as much as they could, it's almost 1,300 miles. Now, it's a long way to go if they were back in Rome at that time, which it appears that they were. So what's the point here is that there are 6 biblical mentions of Priscilla and Aquila, and they're always named together. They're never individually. Have you ever done a waltz all alone? Well, they were waltzing through life together, so they're always named. Now, of those 6 times, 3 times Aquila is named first, and 3 times Priscilla is named first. Paul didn't have any apprehension or problem with whichever way he wrote it down because he thought of them as working together. And Paul wrote in other places in Romans 8:16 and 17 about husbands and wives are both children of God and they're joint heirs together with Christ. He wasn't differentiating, well, husbands are this or wives are that. And you can't help but think he's seen that example of Priscilla and Aquila working together. And of course, even Peter writes that husbands and wives, now this is my paraphrase, are heirs together of the grace of life. So if we take a look at the example and the mentions of Priscilla and Aquila, we should imagine putting our own names in there. Can we live to that example of Priscilla and Aquila? Now, they had a lot of traveling that's gone on. And I said, you know what? They've done a lot of dancing through life in the rain. And there had to be mud along the way because they had a lot of those kinds of experiences. Oh, have you noticed rain without mud? That's kind of what happens. Now, I thought, well, maybe they've traveled 4,000 miles. I'll scale it back for this report, 3,000 miles. That's like going from here to Juneau, Alaska on foot. Some of it maybe over the water. Or if we want to, we can go to San Diego and back. There's another 3,000 miles, but it's likely more than that. And so we have this concept called synergy. That means people are more powerful together than they are working individually. So therefore, it's like 1 + 1 equals 3. In other words, the energy that you can do. My grandfather farmed with horses. One horse can do X amount of work. Two horses can do more than the ability of two individual ones together, which is probably the first time I heard that example there. So we can say that Priscilla and Aquila were a power couple. We know they were hard workers. They know that they traveled, and where they traveled, they made a positive influence, particularly on 3 congregations of Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome, perhaps others. They also had an enormously powerful influence on Apollos, which is an important early church leader. So when we come across these examples in the Bible, let's think of their travels, let's think of the congregations that they served, and know that Priscilla and Aquila should be emboldened in our mind as a power couple. And thank you for the water.